Okay, we're all set.
All right, good evening, everyone. Sorry, I'm just my kids are driving me crazy coming home from some things. I officially start the meeting for the October 4th Electric Utility Advisory Board. Can we start with a roll call, please?
Yeah, sorry about that. Brian O'Blander,
Here.
David Sims,
Here.
Matt Portilla, not here for the roll call. Eric Jeffers
I'm here.
and Ramsey Stevens. Ramsey, well, I see you, I just don't hear you.
Hey, you might have a connection
Well,
issue.
yes, he might be having issues with so go ahead.
Okay, let's continue on. Eric, would you like to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Sure, why not? Let's go. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America,
To the republic.
public for which it stands, one nation, under God,
under God,
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you very much. Are there any additions, deletions, or reordering for tonight's agenda? All right.
No,
Okay, great. Moving on. Besides, there's no extra presentations. Any public comments?
Yes.
I have not received any.
Oh,
wait.
okay. Let me see. How do I do this? Chat?
Is
Or-
there a chance for people to participate live, or does that have to be submitted ahead of time?
You can go ahead and put it in the chat if you would like, or
Yeah, because
You
I
can
don't
read
I don't
that.
have comment cards or anything like that, like a traditional
Yes.
meeting. So normally we just field questions from the audience if they're contributing live, correct?
correct.
Okay, so Richard. did you-
Yes.
State your name and address for the record, please.
And just let me confirm, can you hear me?
I can.
Perfect. Okay, this is Richard Stowe. I live at 414 North Federal Highway in Lake Worth. I wanted to speak of three issues very briefly. One, the first two I could characterize as a strategy for the utilities to, instead of just producing electricity and selling it, also selling like megawatts, where you have a way for utility users or to use less electricity and at the same time have the utility make profit off of less. Two examples are, one is like where the utility would interact with a roofing company or roof manufacturing company, like for specifically to like install white metal roofs on the many structures we have here in Lake Worth. Second is for to establish a like relationship where we could be a distributor for like Havelock wool insulation. And third is to relook at the lighting in like the light pollution in Lake Worth, the street lights. There's the wattages or lumens on those street lights are way too high. And it would be good for the city and the utility to use less lumens in providing the necessary light. The current lighting with the street lights create a lot of light trespass and glare, both of which are harmful to human health.
Okay, thank you for your comments. I don't know the specs on the lighting, but that's something we can look into if needed. I know there's a process for requesting that the lights be partially shielded from back alleys and things like that. I'm not sure about street lighting itself for roadways and sidewalks and pedestrian safety.
Hey, Ryan, this is Ed Liberty. I can provide a comment on that. If you think it's appropriate, you're the chair.
Yeah, that's fine for at this time.
Okay. First of all, with respect to the lighting that we have in the city was selected in 2016 by a committee that largely involved city commissioners, if I remember correctly, perhaps even earlier than that. In the 2016 to 2017 timeframe, 100% of the city's streetlights were replaced, and with LED lights. And the city chose a dark skies compliant, I believe that's the correct term, lighting system. They significantly lowered the wattage and lowered the Kelvin rating on the lights significantly. We have roughly a little over 4,000, roughly about 4,000 streetlights in the city that we operate and maintain. We don't have necessarily jurisdiction over what the DOT installs in the city on the DOT roadways, but we are heavily involved. And of course, we don't have any input on what they do on Route 95, which is more the state DOT, I believe. But we have put a lot of time and effort into streetlights. The streetlights were part of a $23.5 to $25 million energy savings performance contract with Siemens, which involved a number of initiatives, one of which was replacing all of the city streetlights with much more efficient lights than we had before. At the same time, all of the indoor lighting, or the majority of the indoor lighting in the city, was upgraded as well as HVAC systems. An AMI system was installed, and then the solar field. So it was a part of a much larger project. So that's already been addressed. We have not had any complaints about the lights being too bright per se. On occasion, we get a request that's pretty rare, but we do get them on occasion, where somebody would like a shield put up because the light is shining onto their property. They would prefer that it not. In that case, we'll install a shield. And all of the lights that were installed up at the beach complex, I believe, are consistent with that, which would not cause the turtles to, as I would describe it, swim in the wrong direction when they hatch. That's my terminology. I don't think that's a term of science by any stretch, but I believe those lights were compliant for that purpose as well. That's my understanding. That was all done before I arrived, but that's my understanding of what was done with the streetlights.
Okay, great. If someone were to make a request for a shield, would they go to Public Works or directly to the utility department?
They could make that request through customer service and leave that request with a customer service rep, and then they would forward that on to the electric utility. And we do on occasion get those. It's not very often, but it has occurred when somebody would want a shield. We also have private area lights, but go ahead.
I'm sorry, I really didn't mean to interrupt you, but I was going to say to your earlier point, Ed, about the DOT having certain jurisdictions. Richard, you did mention your address is Federal Highway. I believe that's a state road.
Yes,
so maybe that has something to do with the situation that you're experiencing.
No, it is not what I'm experiencing in particular, although, and we did point out to the, there was a contractor that enabled this lighting, Siemens, and we did point out to them that the standard that they claim for state highways was a standard of 4,000 or above Kelvin. We explained to them that, or like through communications with the state DOT, we learned that it was actually the standard was just a working standard, and that that municipalities and obviously counties could ask for exceptions to that, and that's what we did. So we moved it from 4,000 to 2,700. However, that's one side of the equation of like dark skies. The other side is the amount of lumens that are created through the amount of wattage that are installed. And that's where the problem lies right now, because the extreme amount of wattage on these lights, and the state may have their own regulations as far as wattage or lumens. So I'm not speaking to that, but I'm speaking to like overall in the city, the amount of wattage we're using is way over what we need to use. And we could like accrue significant energy savings and quality of life and safety in terms of both the glare and, criminal activity are enhanced when there's increased amounts of glare. So
I would suggest that we have Richard, if you want to go ahead, because I know that the Federal Highway is going to be going some renovations soon.
Yes.
If you want to put a package together, either as a presentation for this group at the next meeting or for presentation for the commissioners, as one of the parts of this, and somehow that can be passed on to FDOT, whoever's in charge of that project.
Yeah, I would suggest you take it directly to the FDOT. So to the extent that we had a contract with Siemens to install, that was a negotiated agreement, and I wasn't here when it was done, but it went through at least 1 to 2 years of negotiations and discussions, and then ultimately that's what the City Hall, the commissioners approved. So they installed what was negotiated in the contract. As far as Siemens is concerned, I can't speak for Siemens, but having been in worked with similar contractors over a number of years, I'm sure they would have been just as happy to install a lower wattage bulb. That would have created even more energy savings, and they were looking to create more energy savings. So certainly Siemens would not be one that would have been pushing for an unreasonably high lighting standard. So again, that all came out of this, I'm like 99% sure the electric utility staff was dictated to from City Hall as to what was going to be installed and by who, and the utility was not involved. Now of course we have to maintain these lights, but we were not involved in the selection, nor do we really have a say in the selection. So that would have to go to DOT for the DOT roadways. We do get some selection, for example, on the cost of the fixtures, the style of fixtures that we want. And then we pay an upcharge for that because we're typically asking for a fixture that's more expensive than what the DOT would be willing to pay for.
I believe our lights, our Cobra heads are 2,700, and that's 25 watts. I think it's 25, but that's the lowest. I'm not sure you can get any lower than 25.
It's not.
I'm sorry?
It is not. None of them are 25 watts, even the alley lights. The alley lights, there's 3 levels. They have like options of wattage with each light. And the lowest wattage, and that would be the alley lights, would be 48 watts. So yes, the standard, like for, like dark
Richard,
sky-
sorry, I hate to interrupt, but we
Yeah.
can't have this back and forth
I'm
for
done.
public comments. So if you want to get with me on the side, I can, or you can get directly with Ed Liberty or
Yes.
Brian, and submit your complaints, and we can see if we can come to some kind of resolution. Because maybe in the future, when it comes time to replacing bulbs, there could be a change order request of some kind. So we can possibly consider that route. Is that acceptable for everyone?
Yes, absolutely. And it's not really a complaint. This is just like an offer to, to the city to improve its standing.
I mean, I don't know how you would measure wattage without actually putting a multimeter up to the bulb itself.
We've done it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We started a group called Dark Sky Lake Worth, and we advocated for, lower wattage and the low Kelvin or color temperature.
Gotcha.
And then we
Well, if you
also
ever want
followed
to
up
get
on-
on the agenda for a presentation, we'd love to have you.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, anyone else? Nope. All right. Moving forward, do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Second,
All right, all those in favor?
aye.
Aye. All right, motion approved. All right, so moving on to the Horizon Energy Integrated Resource Plan, continuation from the prior meeting. All right, who is speaking today?
All right, I'll lead off at Liberty Electric Utility Director, and then I'll turn it over to our friends from Horizon. For members of the public that may be listening at home, just a little background. We conducted our first, we call the resource plan in 2018, about 1 year after my arrival, recognizing that we did not have a firm or specific plan for how we were going to meet our generation requirements going into the future, basically our energy supply requirements for the city. There had been a number of projects that were all had been undertaken under that energy savings performance contract with Siemens. There were power generation contracts that had been entered into in the mid to late 1980s. There were contracts that were entered into in January of 2014 that were expiring in 2019 for what we refer to as supplemental energy. We then acted on that plan. It called for a significant change, addition of a second transmission tie line. That project is underway. Currently expected to go online December of 2023. We have just recently executed the third of three agreements with Florida Power and Light. That document commits us to the December 23 date. It commits them to the December 23 date. It commits us to construct the facilities to receive the tie line, and commits FPL to construct to us. They bear all of their costs to construct to us, and we bear our costs to receive them. And that project is on track with the delivery of the first major piece of equipment arrived on Monday, shortly after the storm passed, and the civil work will be going on shortly, and all of the engineering is effectively complete. Almost all of the permitting is complete. So that's moving along. We also, in that resource plan, identified a significant investment, or in terms of power purchase agreements for solar, utility scale solar. We did enter into those contracts in 2019 with FMPA for 36.55 megawatts of solar. That'll begin flowing by the end of 2023. So those projects are coming along. We now have an opportunity to go further. So since then, we commissioned the 2022 Integrated Resource Plan, and notice I changed the name from Resource Plan to Integrated Resource Plan. The first plan was supply side only, because of the time that we had to do it in, and to make some quick decisions and lay out a path. This particular plan is now looking at also at demand side resources, specifically demand response. Energy conservation is taken into account in the sense that it is already helping to slow our rate of growth of energy delivery and peaks. We've seen that energy conservation on the part of customers, organic conservation, I would call it, is taking place. But we are modeling demand response as an element of the next resource plan. We have selected Horizons Energy to lead us in this effort. They worked with us on the 2018 plan together with Power Engineers, and we're working directly with Horizons Energy on this plan. Tonight we have Greg Turk and Kathy Jones, both of Horizons, and this is not their first rodeo in integrated resource planning, and they have some very, very sophisticated modeling tools. I believe this is at least our third or perhaps fourth meeting on this subject, and they've been busy working in between the meetings, and also having interim meetings with myself and my staff. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Greg and to Kathy to walk us through tonight's presentation and discussion. It's not a one-way presentation. This is meant to be a group discussion. Okay.
Thank you, Ed.
You're welcome.
Good evening, everyone. We last met on September 8th. This group did, and Horizons began the IRP process in conjunction with Lake Worth staff early this summer, June, July timeframe. Since we last met, we have spent significant time documenting the work that we've done. It will take the form of a report that will step through all the inputs, the analytics or tools that Ed was alluding to, as well as the results under a wide variety of conditions. The purpose of tonight's discussion is kind of a check-in to show you where the project is going and what our base case and some of our selected alternative cases are showing at this point in time. If you may recall that to do this, we use what is the established methodology for doing this, which is to use a power planning model that can integrate the supply and demand side planning problems within one piece of software. It optimizes a resource plan that incorporates not just costs, but also the reliability of the power system. It incorporates other aspects that may be key to clients or to stakeholders. In this case, that takes the form of environmental sensitivity, particularly maintaining plans that maintain a glide path towards significant carbon reductions with the goal of zero carbon emissions from power by the year 2050. Okay, so I'm going to show the same kind of graph, excuse me, for the next few slides. And I want to just basically describe, this is kind of one of our bread and butter slides for doing resource planning. So we're doing a long-term resource plan. We're going from the years 2023 through 2050. And this is, that's the x-axis, and the y-axis is.
Oh,
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I can't, we're still looking at the agenda, Suhi. I believe we might need to give screen control to Greg. There we go. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
This is going to make a much more enjoyable presentation, or at least hopefully interesting. Okay, so so the things we're going to, here real quickly, things we're going to go through are an identification of the resource needs. We're going to step through some of our base case resource plan results, describe some of our sensitivities. And by sensitivities, I mean we'll make changes in our operating assumptions or economic assumptions, cost assumptions, and see how they change the resource plan. We'll talk specifically about the carbon footprint and do a call out there to a significant concern or what shall I say, sensitivity towards how Lake Worth can achieve 100% carbon reduction by 2050. And then I was going to summarize with some observations. So this particular slide, as I started to say, is a slide that incorporates our forecast horizon. It's very long-term. It's necessarily long-term because we're talking about doing dramatic things with regard to the types of resources that will fulfill the needs, the demand for electricity, both energy and capacity for the foreseeable future. And it goes out to 2050 because oftentimes that's seen as a goal or even a later goal for a lot of the environmental programs. So that's the x-axis. The y-axis is megawatts, and it's meant to be megawatts of either demand, which is this line right here, demand plus what we call a planning reserve. In the state of Florida for non-investor-owned utilities, that's generally 15%, and that's what we've adopted here. So 15% of a 97, 98 megawatt peak is about 112 megawatts. And then we imply, you can see a somewhat gradual increasing pattern. We imply a 0.5% compounded annual growth rate of demand. So essentially, Ed Liberty's and the electric utility group's job is to maintain capacity, the capacity needs of the city across this time frame, not just on an annual basis, but down to every minute and second of operation. So there's a capacity component, there's an energy component, a reliability component, and an environmental component. But anyway, this is what we plan to. And then if we look to see the resources that Lake Worth Beach has under contract today or owns, it's this orange line. And so what we see is a decline in some of the early years due to resources declining or contracts terminating. That includes the retirement of Stanton Coal ownership. We see some uptick here, and that's due to the FMPA contracts that Ed alluded to. And Then we see a steep drop off here, and this corresponds to some of the resources associated with Tom G. Smith Generating Plant in Lake Worth Beach. And then down here, these declines are due to the assumed retirement date in 2043 of St. Lucie, as well as the retirement of the FMPA contracts. Okay, so gray line, orange line. And so this difference between these two lines is what's needed, at least from a capacity standpoint. So our planning problem is to do a couple things. It's to make sure we meet that demand, do it at a least cost, and maintain the environmental goals. So our base case, if you will, or do nothing case, other than to rely on the ability to get an all requirements contract external to the city, would represent this area right here. Or alternatively, the city has a wide variety of technologies available to it to fill up this space, if you will, in a fashion that's least cost and again, environmentally sensitive. So
Let me add here that what we do in the near term in that hash marked or dotted area, the gray area, if you will, I'm colorblind, so I'll call it the gray area, is we fill that with the supplemental contract. So the first supplemental contract was put in place in January of 2014. And then that expired and then was renewed January of 2019. And those could go as long as 7 years. So it's anticipated that the city will have a series of successive supplemental contracts going forward to fill the gap between resources that it owns or has contractual commitments to and what it needs. So prior to 2014, from about 2001 to about 2014, January 1 of 14, the city was a part of the FMPA All Requirements Project, and the city didn't have to do any of this planning. This was all done for the city by FMPA. But with the city having exited the All Requirements Project effective January 1 of 2014, the city took on the task of planning for its resources. And there were no big decisions that were made at that point. The big was other than to say, let's get a supplemental capacity contract, actually capacity energy contract. And that's what we did in January 2014. And then when I arrived, we went out for bid and entered into the contract that we have in place now. That started January of 2019. So, but that's how we fill that gap today with these supplemental agreements. And I would imagine that city, short of entering into the ARP or some kind of an all requirements contract, will continue to have supplemental contracts and chart its own course for many years to come.
Ed, can you enlighten us if you know the answer to this question? Do you know why the recommendation was to exit the all requirements back in 2014?
I can provide you an answer. Some of it is speculative, and some of it is actual, statements and facts that were made at the time. So if you have to go back to the 2001 timeframe, 2003 timeframe. I was actually in and about the city doing business development, and the city was very short of resources, was completely on its own, buying and selling on the wholesale market to meet its needs. And the city very much needed to build a new power plant or invest in a share of a new power plant somewhere in the state. The state at that time was littered or covered with independent power producers looking for sites to build power plants. And the city found, or was found by, I believe it was AES, and entered into a contract with AES to build a new unit, roughly 170 megawatt unit, 175 megawatt unit at the power plant. Was going to be a GE Frame 7F. And the waste heat that unit would produce would spin some portion of the power plant. Some of the units in the power plant, at least one, was subsequently retired. They were going to maybe put a new steam turbine in, but it was going to be 175 megawatts on the property, selling most of it wholesale, owned by a private company called AES, with the city getting some of the power. That contract fell apart circa 2003 to 2005, when the energy markets crashed. The project constructor or the project developer put the project into bankruptcy, and the project went away. Being at, my understanding was at that point, the city did not have, obviously, a way to meet its needs, and it decided to throw in and join the All Requirements Project, and it stayed there for a little over 10 years, my understanding, 10 to 12 years. During the course of the city's membership in the All Requirements Project, which is separate than membership in FMPA, so the All Requirements Project is one aspect of the FMPA membership, and a number of cities statewide are involved in the All Requirements Project. Costs for the All Requirements Project members grew to be rather significant. FMPA had entered into some long-term interest rate swaps with regards to a power plant that FMPA was planning to build, and also entered into some long-term, what later on turned out to be above market trades or futures contracts for fuel supply. The swaps and the fuel supply contracts got upside down, and the price to the members of the ARP went significantly higher, is my understanding of what happened in history. At the same time, the city was in a contractual dispute with FMPA, which ultimately went to mediation or arbitration. The city lost that dispute. It revolved around the pricing for a gas pipeline that was assumed by the city to the power plant that still exists today. So there was a lot of, that was bad blood's the right term, but not great feelings between the FMPA ARP and the city of Lake Worth Beach, none of which are evident today with today's leadership of FMPA, I should point out. As I understand the history, sometime around 2012, the city decided to exit the ARP, prepared an RFP, gave notice to the ARP that it was going to be exiting the ARP, and in fact did so December 31 of 2013 and entered into the contract for supplemental power starting January 1 of 2014. The city remained a participant in the St. Lucie project and also the Stanton project, which are two FMPA projects. And the city continues in those projects today. And we continue to get great technical support and management support, general business support from FMPA. We also then subsequently entered into the FMPA Solar 1 and FMPA Solar 2 contracts as power purchase agreements for utility scale solar at very attractive prices. I think I gave you a lot more information than you wanted, but I think it helps set everybody up, kind of level set, have people understand what is our involvement in FMPA and how did we get to where we are today.
No, great. Thank you very much for the background especially for the new members.
Now,
Yeah,
prior to the
that was-
2002-2000 timeframe, the types of things that we're talking about tonight in terms of a resource plan, my assumption is that those things were previously done by utility staff, and utility's been around for well over 100 years. So some form of resource planning had been taking place over many, many, many years. But to the extent that it occurred, that it existed in the past, that skill set basically atrophied or went away, retired, otherwise left the city probably in the early 2000s.
Okay, so I'll pick it up from here. So this again gives us our resource needs. What we're going to do in the next few slides is to show some of our current results for our base case and a couple of alternative cases. And essentially what we're going to do is fill in this in a least cost fashion. So our base case assumption as of,
Greg, I want to reinforce this. I agree least source fashion, but with the constraint of meeting the carbon reduction goal.
yes.
So it's a dual goal there. Primary being reduced to CO2 emissions in the least cost fashion.
Well, I have to actually ask that, is that actually a constraint to meet those goals, or is that just a loose guideline?
In the model, it's a physical constraint
Okay,
that must be met. So I can actually show you, here's one, this is the trajectory that was proposed by the director some weeks ago. And when we look at our 9 alternative scenarios, if we assume that power can be obtained from outside of the city by an entity that is looking to also achieve zero carbon by 2050, the city across all those 9 scenarios is able to achieve the zero carbon footprint.
So
Now that's in contrast to if they don't, then it's going to be much more difficult for the city to achieve zero carbon.
So what's basically happening is that the largest players in the state that have the biggest generation resources, without a mandate to do so, other than their own shareholder value, are planning to bring down their CO2 emissions significantly. So the marketplace that we would buy from is becoming much cleaner. So just by continuing to buy from that marketplace, in one scenario, we would get cleaner ourselves. So think of it this way: the local publics decided to only provide organic vegetables. Well, I guess we're all going organic, right? And that's effectively what's happening here, is that the big players in the state are all greening their portfolios on that glide path, or perhaps even more aggressively. Is that a good way to explain it, Greg?
Yes.
so for example, if someone popped up out of nowhere with like a coal plant and they were offering the cheapest electric rates possible, we wouldn't consider them at all because of our commitment to the zero carbon emissions, correct?
I would expect that I would have zero support in bringing that idea forward.
From a modeling standpoint, it becomes intractably costly for that coal plant to run as you get to lower and lower levels of emission. So that's one thing that the power planning model does, is it drives out, if you have this kind of constraint, essentially, and this is happening in the larger marketplace, coal plant capacity, their capacity factors, the number of hours they run per year has declined, both in response to higher costs or lower competitor costs, but also in light of, for instance, carbon pricing or renewable portfolio standards drives a kind of implicit cost on the operation of a coal plant.
And also for natural gas plants, like what are their projected lifetimes of those plants? Like anything that was built today, how long are they predicted to last for before being retired?
Well, the numbers that I've seen, you'd find very few investors willing to go out more than 20 years. Although the plants, as judging by our own plants, you could get 40 plus years of actual life out of them. But for the purpose of financings, and Greg, you're probably fairly involved with this, but 20 years or 25 years?
Well, so the physical operation life would be much longer. It would be closer to that 40 plus year time frame. If you're talking about securitization of a loan, it could get a little dicier. And as you're suggesting, it's an increasingly difficult and regionalized environment for financing large natural gas facilities. Actually, Florida has been a fairly aggressive in developing the efficient combined cycle natural gas in the last few years, but it's somewhat of an exception.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna jump back to this slide, and it's a little it's got some action going on here, but let me try to simplify it. The black line is the peak plus reserve. We're trying to build to that. As Ed said, this would take the form of a supplemental or capacity contract of some kind. The orange is the existing resources of Lake Worth out through time. And then the model does its magic. So what we do is we say we have alternative resources that are available that can be built, and we take into account the operating characteristics, the operating costs, the how they would be financed, what their capital costs are, and some very specific things about as you add more and more of those resources, how they might be able to contribute in the different markets. So those types of resources would include solar entitlement, which is basically where in the future the city could go out and buy an ownership share of some other resource. CTs are combustion turbines. They are gas-fired resources. Behind the meter, that's resource that's like rooftop solar. Battery, these are assumed to be utility scale batteries, so they're very large and obtain the benefits of economy of scale. We also allow combined cycle, which is a much more efficient than a combustion turbine, but is a higher capital cost. RICE, which is internal combustion resource. Demand response. This is assumed to be a kind of interruptible demand response, such as interrupting air conditioner load and other water heaters and other significant, mostly on the residential side. Solar PPA. This would be a continuation of going out into the market in the near term and identifying possible market opportunities for obtaining additional solar megawatts.
Provide
So,
a bit more,
question,
a little bit more information here on the one might ask, what's the difference between a solar entitlement and a solar PPA? And I'll offer up a suggestion, Greg, or a thought on what that is. So solar power purchase agreement is entirely different than a solar entitlement. Under a power purchase agreement, the city makes no financial investment whatsoever, has no debt associated with the project. It's just buying megawatts under a firm or escalating price over typically a 20-year term. Under a solar entitlement, that would be similar to, for example, our entitlements that we have in the St. Lucie nuclear project or the Stanton project, where the city has taken an equity position through the sale of bonds and as a part owner in the project. So up until the Inflation Reduction Act, whether you actually believe it will do that or not is irrelevant, but the act does allow for a direct payment benefit to municipalities of the equivalent of the tax benefit that a private entity would get. So that means that under certain scenarios, it might be advantageous for the city to take an equity position through a bond subscription in a utility scale solar project. So solar entitlement it refers to utility scale, meaning 75 megawatts or perhaps even larger in the future, because if you were planning ahead, you might go more than 75 megawatts to get significant economies of scale. And solar PPA is also understood to be utility scale. So not 1 or 2 megawatts, but something that's 75 megawatts or perhaps larger. The combustion turbine is a simple cycle peaking turbine, a gas turbine, and combined cycle is what it becomes when we do heat recovery on the back to produce steam to turn a steam turbine. And RICE is that reciprocating engine. Very simply said, that's like a big diesel engine. They're rather large, probably 10, 15, 20 megawatt sizes, and they're typically powered by natural gas and not necessarily oil today. So those are some of the basics of what you're looking at there.
Eric, you had a comment?
Yeah, my question was just what turbines coming online in 2030 that's going to give us 40 megawatts of power?
Yeah, that's so when we build these resource plans, we have generic resources. It's not an identified resource. It's as a named plant, but rather it's a technology that would be the most economic choice based on known and anticipated costs of construction and operation of a combustion turbine. So it's sorry, go ahead.
What the model is saying is that in that time frame, you're going to need a turbine. And it is not because it specifically loves turbines, but what it's recognizing that you need the capacity of the turbine. So you also have what's called spinning reserve and quick start capability. And remember, we have a lot of megawatt hours that we have to fill after dark. So we can't fill them all with sunshine and batteries. So
Right.
the model is
I get
saying
it.
that we're gonna need that turbine capacity because we have to hug the black line to meet our reserve requirements. And the model is saying, hey, around that time, you're going to need that. And that ties
Right.
into the fact that our 11 megawatts of Stanton goes away at the end of 2025. And at the end of 23, starting in 24, we retire 35 megawatts of steam capacity at our own power plant. We don't close the power plant. We're just going to retire 35 megawatts of steam. So you have continued growth. Stanton went away. Our steam units went away. And then we also assume that our 1965 to 1975 vintage gas turbines will only have a 5-year rolling lifespan because they're already beyond end of life. Yet we're going to continue to harvest value out of them. But it's hard to say that they'll be there for 10, 15, or 20 years. We're willing to say, yeah, maybe we can get another 5 out of them. And we keep inspecting and hoping we can, in fact, get another 5. So, but eventually you run out of, card tricks, right? And you say, okay, now we need some capacity. And the model's saying, yeah, and that's most likely going to need to be a peaking combustion turbine.
Gotcha.
Model
So
saying
two-
combustion turbine, but I thought we were getting rid of carbon fuels. I thought that was tapering down to 2050.
No,
You've
we
got-
didn't say, no, we didn't say we were getting rid of carbon fuels. We said we're going to, we would be on a glide path. And what this model is going to show you is that it's going to be very difficult to get to zero. This goes back to one of the quirks of the Earth spinning around the sun, right? Is that it gets dark at night, and we have hundreds of thousands of megawatt hours that have to be fulfilled after sundown.
The glide
Uh,
path goes to 0 at 2050, and you've got some combustion turbine capacity at 2050.
Yes, we do. Yeah, they're going to have it. You're not going to be able to meet the inertia and the spinning reserve requirements of the grid and grid stability and reliability without combustion turbines. So this model is saying that it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to build a combustion turbine. We may enter into a capacity contract in that time frame for combustion turbines, but that's the reality.
That was.
So
one
the
of my
reality,
next
if that's
follow-up.
reality, that means the glide path isn't really going to 0 at 2050, according to this model.
Well, let's take a deep breath there. Let's come back down for a second. There's a little company next door called Florida Power and Light. You probably heard of them. If you've done any reading, you'll notice that they have talked about blending hydrogen into the fuel supply for combustion turbines. So the expectation is, and this is already being done in other places around the country on an experimental basis, there are pilot programs underway, which so far is successful, with the major turbine manufacturers are beginning to blend in small percentages of hydrogen. So the concept is to use renewables, high volume of renewables during daytime hours to produce hydrogen, which will be blended into the gaseous fuel, which goes in these combustion turbines. So that's the technology path that we're on. So I think we have to look at the glide path and look at the capacity plan. But you don't have the option to say, gee, I don't like it, let's just turn the lights off. Now you have to have a capacity plan. You're required by law to do that. So what the model is saying is under this base case scenario, this base case, combustion turbines are a piece of the pie. I don't think there's anybody who says that combustion turbines will completely disappear, other than people saying, yeah, we're going to go 100% nuclear and solar.
With these combustion turbines, you're talking about the hydrogen in them. Is the proportion of hydrogen going to increase as time goes
Yes.
on? I mean, can you get closer to a pure hydrogen turbine in
No.
these?
Well,
That's kind of high temperature, though.
yeah, theoretically, yes. Practically, we don't know yet, right? So the first units that I'm aware of are operating with as much as about 5% blends, and they're experimenting because obviously you don't want to destroy the turbine. It's a very volatile fuel, but there's a lot of work. By the way, are you a mechanical engineer by any possibility?
I had an undergraduate aerospace degree, and so I know the burn temperature of hydrogen is very high.
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason I bring that up is not to be flip about this, but there's this month's issue of mechanical engineering. The Association of Mechanical Engineering the ASME, this month's magazine has an excellent section on blending hydrogen fuels. So I have to say that about 80% of my knowledge on hydrogen came from reading those articles in the last week or so. But there's some great research and development happening around the country, plus what FPL is doing locally and getting ready to blend hydrogen fuels. They're so convinced that it's the way to go, that it's a part of their long-term resource plan, and they've actually mentioned it in their investor presentations. So that's the way, that's a very, very viable market. Whether they'll get to 100%, I don't know, but they're talking about combining multiple cycles. I want to say the Rankine cycle and the Brayton cycle in a turbine, if you're familiar with those terms. But
Yeah.
it's very, very cool stuff. But it's coming. It is coming.
So from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, the graph we're looking at is a combustion turbine, but with the assumption that there's going to be a reduced carbon footprint eventually. So the glide path going to zero and our need for combustion turbines at some point is going to intersect to a 0 point, like maybe beyond 2050. Is that correct?
Well, actually, it's going to be by 2050 or clearly close to 2050. As a matter of fact, FPL has picked a more aggressive target than we have. And guess what? They're not planning to take a torch to their combustion turbines. They're planning to use them in spite of the fact that they're going to get to zero. So that's how confident they are.
And this will be revisited in how long for the resource plan? 10 years?
The resource plan? No, I would say we would probably not want to go more than about 4 years, 5 years at the most between resource plans.
Okay.
Certainly, as you near a key decision point, you should probably do another resource plan ahead of making that decision, just to reconfirm. So we wouldn't want, let's fast forward, right, to 2026 or 2027. We wouldn't want to be making a key decision at that point based on studies that we did in 2022. This should be a refresh document. The very, very large utilities effectively do this annually. In Florida, they call it a 10-year site plan, but they've got dozens and dozens of staff working full time on their resource plans. We're obviously, FPL has 5 million customers. We have 27,000, right? We wouldn't need to do this annually, but I would personally not go more than 5 years. And I certainly would have it done before a major decision on a resource commitment.
Okay, so in 5 years, this graph could look a little bit different.
Yeah, the work that Horizons did for us in 2018, we didn't just dump it on the drive someplace and not use it. We referred to that over time and used it to guide our decisions. For example, in the tie line and also in the significant jump to solar. In our solar capacity, that plan, I believe, suggested 25 megawatts. We went further and went to 36.55. So it's a living document. You do use it.
If I can just point out one more thing, this is a little bit deceiving because as Ed was saying, this is the CTs, all this is ramping up because we foresee that the value of capacity gets much stronger, particularly in this time frame. And so the batteries and the combustion turbine and the demand response are all ramping up over this early 30s time frame for the same reason. The value of capacity is increasing. And the capacity factor, or how many hours per year that this is actually being utilized, isn't being represented on this graph. The combustion turbine will only be used as a must need in order to fill in the capacity gaps. So not 1,000 hours per year.
To put that in a different way is we currently buy capacity under our supplemental capacity contract. What this is saying is that there's going to come a point around 2030 where it would be cheaper for the city to take an ownership interest or an entitlement interest in or some kind of a firm contract for capacity from a CT. And
Okay, that was
Greg?
my question that I had.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if in your head, like, does this look like taking an ownership stake in something that's existing or is being built now? But we looked at a black line earlier that indicated nothing new is being built now. So like, I'm just wondering where that's gonna come from if we don't do it ourselves. It
Well,
seems like it might be hard around 2030 to find somebody willing to sell a share in a turbine plant.
It at the moment it's actually rather easy. First of all, people are still building CTs and combined cycles. Largely, FPL is still building, and they're retiring coal and they're building combined cycles, so they're reducing their carbon footprint dramatically through that process. They're also cleaning up their older turbines and adding more turbines. So the older turbines, even though their emission rate is the same as the old rate, the volume is lower because they dispatch less, right? So they add new, much more efficient, much lower emitting units, and they take the base load and they retire coal at the same time. So those older turbines remain on the books for capacity purposes, and they operate less and less and less. There are also units out there in the marketplace, and FMPA, and this is public information, is in the process of buying these turbines that have rolled off their 20-year power purchase agreements. They're buying those at a fraction of the cost of building new. They'll have a limited operation, but they are a valuable portion of the portfolio. OUC is doing the exact same thing. So they're both entering into contracts to purchase these older plants. I say older, that are now 20 years old, keeping in mind that we're still running plants that are 50 years old. And they're buying these plants at 20 to 22, 23, 24 years as they roll off their contracts, and they're getting them at good prices. So we could purchase capacity from them under a specific long-term contract, a piece of the plant that they've bought, or we could take a piece of some new plant that might be built in that time frame. What plant that is, we don't know, but we're saying is the model tells us that's what we should go find in that time frame.
Okay, yeah, I think I'm just getting ahead of the rest of this presentation, so I'll stop asking questions for now. Thank you.
You should keep asking questions. This is kind of good stuff for everybody to have a good understanding of it and how it drives our business and shapes decisions that we make.
Yeah, so like the other thing I was just gonna ask then is, so for now, it is more fiscally and carbon advantageous for us to import that gap than it is to start looking for these entitlements and agreements now. Is that a true statement?
That's a true statement. However, it'll be important, and demand responses will be a good example of this. If we see a strike price that is attractive, we should jump on it, right?
Got it. Okay, yeah, understood.
But what's important in the exercise is to understand, well, how would you know is a good price, right?
Mm-hmm.
So having this model will help us understand, and Greg will walk us through that and say, hey, you could grab some stuff at or below X price. That'd be good to grab because that's going to be a good investment. And the solar that we grabbed in FMPA Solar 1 and 2 certainly met that criteria, which is why we went for 36 megawatts instead of the initial 25.
Got it.
Well, you just set me up for a segue, Ed. Unless there's another question or comment. Okay. So this is our base case. Assume that we can, for instance, obtain this solar PPA for a lower price. This assumes a $40 PPA. If we assume a $35, and I'm just going to flip them back and forth. So if it's a $35 PPA, it turns out that suddenly it's not a lot of megawatts, but it's kind of the next tranche of megawatts. This is 5 megawatts in the base case. If you're able to obtain a solar PPA for a 1/8 of the less 7/8 of the price of our original assumption.
So let's put that in the context, and I like that you've done this. So when he says $40, what does that mean? So $40 it refers to as the price of the PPA is $40 per megawatt hour, and that means that the owner of that solar plant is willing to sell power under a 20-year contract, typically escalating at 1%, 2%, or 3%, starting at $40. $40 is a real number in the marketplace. That's what FMPA has made available publicly with regards to its projects that they've received bids at or below $40 per megawatt hour. I certainly, as an FMPA board member, can't disclose the actual dollar value on those contracts, but we did do some sensitivity analysis knowing that I can't disclose and I won't disclose. But we said, gee, what if it would happen to be $5 lower? And that's not because these contracts are $5 lower, but if the marketplace was out there, if it got to 35, would that change our decision point? And you can see, if you could get a solar PPA at $35 a megawatt hour, yes, it would change under the base case. And I see that we have one of the viewers has posed a question on what are the underlying assumptions in the base case. But certainly when you say 35 or 40 or $45 per megawatt hour, it would move those numbers around. So clearly, if you had units that were well above $40 a megawatt hour, you'd say under the base case scenario, you wouldn't enter into that contract. It wouldn't make sense. But Greg, why don't we explain what assumptions are in the base case? Probably the biggest one, other than the capacity thing we talked about, would be fuel pricing.
Well, I think the question was behind the meter that I saw in the chat was behind the meter. And that was based on, and Kathy, jump in if I'm not giving a complete and accurate answer, but what we did is we took a look at the penetration levels of other entities in Florida, and we're looking to identify a penetration level consistent with that of, say, Florida Power and Light or other entities. Is there anything, Kathy, that you could add to that?
Yes, that's correct, Greg. So we're starting out at your current levels of behind the meter of the 1.4 megawatts, with that increasing to 3.23% penetration of your total peak, which is consistent with what we're seeing in FRCC. So that behind the meter forecast then continues to grow based on that.
So our behind the meter percentage today is approximately 1.5%. Of our peak. That number is growing. So you've assumed then that it's going to double, which I think is reasonable. Some of the realities of our market is that we have about 50% of our residential properties are rentals. So it's less likely that tenants are going to invest in rooftop systems. That doesn't mean they won't, but it's less likely. But planning on an absorption rate or adoption rate that's commensurate with what their neighbors are seeing is probably a reasonable planning assumption. The specific question that came in on the chat was, what assumptions underpin the BTM forecast? And I'm assuming that's the base case forecast.
It's the behind the meter.
Or behind the meter. Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. So besides that, then would it be helpful to just talk about what assumptions underpin the base case, so that we have that as well?
Yeah, I'd love to hear all the assumptions that underpin the base case, please.
Okay.
I got the BTM incorrect.
Kathy, is that something you could articulate? I can start.
Well, I mean,
Like not in detail, just, like how do we know that the import price is going to stay the import price as the model predicts it? That seems like it could vary wildly. That's mostly my question, but
yeah,
we
okay.
can get to behind the meter.
So the answer is we don't. Yes, it's a very uncertain aspect of the planning process and planning assumptions. And that's the reason that we incorporate, I'm just going to jump down here again. We run all of our cases under 9 different scenarios. So each of these scenarios assumes that we're running the entire North American footprint under different drivers, different underlying drivers that change the electricity prices. So drivers like high demand, low demand, high natural gas, low natural gas, treatment of carbon, and so on. So we look to see, we don't know what prices are going to be in the future. So we look to bound the range of prices for energy capacity, environmental, and some of the other key prices like ancillary services by running these cases under a variety of plausible alternative scenarios. So the high demand forecast, the high natural gas forecast, those will have higher energy prices. High demand will have very high capacity prices, low NG, lower energy prices, and so on.
And also, if you refer back to to our introductory presentation from when we first got started, you'll see a lot of the information behind the differentials in the energy prices and the assumptions that went into the different scenarios.
Okay, yeah, I remember some of that, and I'll try to find those PDFs. I have them somewhere. I don't know. It just seems like a lot of sensitivity we're giving up to a third party in that interim gap that will immediately affect us all until 2030.
Yeah, one comment about this presentation is that this was not included in the backup materials on the website.
True, we saw this presentation today. This is a working session. We said, well, let's have something ready for today and have it out there.
Oh, no, I just assumed there'd be slides available, that's all.
Yeah. We do have a comment online as well from Commissioner McBoy. I'll read it out loud so it's in the record. I very much see the importance of grid scale batteries, parentheses, and other forms of energy storage, close parentheses. That said, combined cycle, solar combustion turbine, etc., produce energy, but batteries only store energy produced by other sources. I'm not understanding how batteries are on the same graph, adding in as a source to reach roughly 110 megawatts. So I'll try the answer. If I get it wrong, Greg, you can correct me. So thank you, Commissioner McBoy, for submitting the question. Batteries are on the graph because it does give us capacity, and the graph is a capacity graph. So we would charge those batteries ideally with large volumes of renewable energy produced during the day. So it will allow us to make even greater investments in renewable energy, store that energy, and use it to then offset the overnight hours or the on-peak needs, and our peak tends to happen around the time that solar is declining in production. So our peak is typically in the 5 to 7 p.m. range, 4:30 to 7-ish range. Our coincidental peaks in the transmission system tend to happen very reliably right around in that 5 o'clock hour. And that's around the time that production on the solar resources is dropping off significantly and rapidly, going to zero. So then what would happen is the batteries would then kick in and then discharge the overproduction, if you will, that we might have had during the day and release that energy to be used in the evening. So that would be the basic concept there. So batteries would be a very good part of the resource. Batteries would also give us some benefit of perhaps solving some local unique situations around substations. But this is just looking at on a macro level. We may have some other micro benefits to batteries that might accelerate the deployment even further.
And the way that we're describing it here, and we're using it in this model, we call this, it's utility scale, and it's connected to the transmission system, and the localized things would be more of a distribution solution. Okay, I'm just going to show a couple of other. So we showed base case, the solar PPA. Now let's assume that we're in a world where natural gas prices are high and chronically high, and the value of capacity is quite a bit higher than what we have assumed to date in our base case, $54 a kW year. We assume a lower trajectory over that time period. So it's the same peak, it's the same existing resources, and it's a significantly different resource plan. In this case, it makes sense to acquire larger percentages of the purchases that we can make external system, and then certain technologies such as the solar grows from 5 megawatts to 15 megawatts. the demand response comes in much more quickly. The batteries start much more quickly and grow to a higher level. And then we meet the balance with a supplemental contract. So that's an alternative. And by the way, this would be, so here we're relying on a supplemental, somebody else to provide firm capacity to meet up this, to make up this remaining gap out here when St. Lucie retires and other things. But based on the high natural gas assumptions and $54 kW. As an aside, we're running right now 9 scenarios and about 10 different sensitivities per scenario. So we're running about 90 scenarios to look at a variety of different conditions. And so this is one of those scenarios / sensitivities. Questions, comments about the graph?
Yeah, so on the supplemental side, what supplemental is saying, the supplemental resource is generation in the peninsula. So your model is taking into account what has been publicly stated by the various large utilities in the state in terms of what they're going to be building, what their emission rates are going to be, right? So the model is saying, knows what the alternative is, the market. So it knows the emission content of the market or the carbon content of the market. And it's saying that under these certain scenarios, you're better off buying that lower carbon content product from the market as opposed to trying to create it on your own, right?
Yep.
It's going to vary the amount that you should make on your own, depending on the cost scenario, right? And it's saying the market's going to have this whole bunch of clean stuff, right? Or cleaner stuff. I wouldn't say clean, but cleaner stuff than it had before, and you'll be accessing that, right?
Yep. Well, and just to be clear, the $54 kW sensitivity, the purpose of that is to say, again, it's market opportunity. What we're seeing under high natural gas, carbon, and so on is that the value of capacity in the larger marketplace also is going to take off over this time frame. So if you can obtain $54 kW capacity price, then secure it through this contract rather than some alternative assumption that we would have about the larger market.
Right. So we do have a question from Ramsey Stevens. Question being, is behind the meter storage included in the demand response behind the meter or somewhere else? So my assumption would be a couple of things. Behind the meter storage is not a well understood and well quantified technology with a cost to it at the moment. And I think it models much like rooftop behind the meter solar. It's really an element of that. That would be my understanding, but how did you model that, or did you not model it?
We did not model behind the meter storage. The economics are such that utility scale storage, you can see this gray band here, are just swing in the favor of obtaining utility scale solar over behind the meter. I'm sorry, behind utility scale batteries over behind the meter batteries. Now, if there's some ancillary benefit that is quantified for us from behind the meter storage, we could incorporate that and make that part of a plan, but that'd have to be parameterized for us. And in general, we just don't see the economics playing out.
Well, if I might comment on that, from a residential point of view in Florida, people make a choice to put in very expensive generators or low-cost generators. If you instead were doing rooftop solar with on-site behind-the-meter storage, and you're thinking about, well, should I put my money into generators and fossil fuel generators, or should I put it into storage? In Florida, that's definitely a part of people's figuring. And I would also see, if I've already made that choice based on hurricane, my risk level that I want to tolerate for my house, my interest in demand response is going to go way up because I say, hey, you want to cut me out for an hour or half an hour, whatever it is that you want to cut me out. I've got on-site storage that'll last me for X amount of time. I'm going to be quite a bit more interested in demand response at that point. If Ed's going to give me a pretty good price for it.
Well, you know, there's a thing called liquidated damages. So when we enter into capacity contracts, there are some pretty strict penalties on this counterparty, pretty stiff penalties for not performing. So if we were going to take something like that and put it in our capacity plan and say, okay, instead of buying capacity for quick start to meet our reserves on a wholesale basis, we're going to buy bits and pieces from individual customers. There's going to be some pretty significant penalties for those technologies not performing. Because we'd be in a situation where we'd have lights out if we don't meet our requirement. So we face that today, even in our own nominations for transmission. You don't reserve that capacity for transmission and you don't reserve the generation capacity. You've got some pretty serious consequences. Same thing with the contracts we have if the counterparties don't perform. So that has to be looked at very closely. The storage that I think we're more likely to see is customers who will install storage, which will extend their ability to get benefit from their own rooftop solar systems or ground-mounted solar systems to give them more ride-through capability for their own purposes. But it's highly unlikely that anybody's going to be able to build storage capacity at a rate that's going to compete with utility scale storage capacity.
Yeah, no, I wasn't suggesting that very many people would put in such a significant amount of storage at a behind the meter scale that they'd be selling that storage back to the grid. Collectively, yeah, you might get a little bit, but I don't think it's going to be very high. But in terms of at the residential scale choices that people make, a lot of those things are linked together. The other one that I wondered about is, does your modeling does it hardwire the rate of rooftop solar adoption and saying, well, we think it's going to grow at X amount, or does it solve for that? And my question is based on, as people become more aware of the fluctuations in natural gas prices, simply as a hedge against and to have stable pricing, that will drive more people to be interested in rooftop solar or in solar contracts. But the instability and the ability to hedge seems to me that needs to be something that the model doesn't hardwire but solves for.
Well, the direct answer to your question is that we do it's an exogenous forecast, so if you will, it's hardwired. So
Yeah.
what we did is we looked to identify the level of penetration that the neighbors to Lake Worth Beach, what levels that they would obtain behind the meter, and then implemented that.
Numbers that we're looking at for rooftop solar, behind the meter solar, and they're probably in a range of about $3 to $3.50 a watt installed. And that's not going to happen on a property that a tenant is renting. So there's some question as to how widespread that will come. It's very, very hard to get speculative. That's why you don't want to go too many years between doing these models, because we could be sitting here 4 years from now and there's an advancement in roofing shingles that have a solar component to them, right? Or something like that.
They've existed for 20 years.
Right, but in spite of that, we don't see them out there in great economic value yet. So the question, maybe in brand new construction in certain parts of the country, you start to see that, but we haven't seen any penetration yet, even though it's been out there for a long time. So it would be hard to model, again, a capacity plan that says, oh yeah, a whole bunch of that stuff's going to happen when it's been out there for many years and it hasn't happened. Now, with high gas prices, maybe. I think something. I think eventually that's got to happen. It's intuitive. Why wouldn't it happen, right? As more roofs get replaced down the road, will they get replaced with solar panels? Conversely, what we also don't know is whether the insurance crisis, and I say crisis because the homeowners insurance, so all of us who own a home here in Florida are going to undoubtedly see probably 20 or 30% increases in the cost of insuring our homes. And I've read, and and sadly, that some insurance companies may be hesitant to insure a home that has solar panels on them. So I don't,
Babcock Ranch, a new development in the last 2 decades, I don't remember whether it's 1 decade, was pretty close to the path of Ian, and they came through very well. Theirs
They
is
did.
not rooftop, it's field, but
Right.
so I'm a little hesitant about, a somewhat alarmist view on it.
no, I'm not intending to be alarmist, but we don't have space in our city for 100 megawatts of solar.
I'll add to that too. The insurance is definitely an issue now with new solar installations, myself included, where my roof is past the 15-year requirement for being considered a viable roof. I have ground mount solar, and they still wouldn't cover my solar panels. And I'm now on Citizens, where they won't touch it as a secondary structure. And I can imagine that people who have older roofs with solar facing similar issues. So I'm pretty much self-insured at this point for my structure. So I haven't field tested it with the category 5 or category anything. But I'm waiting for the day when a hurricane is going to come barreling down Palm Beach County and seeing what happens. Because that project out there on the West Coast, that sounds remarkable. But like Ed said, the insurance costs are definitely going to be considering that in the future as more people adopt these technologies. 20-30% seems generous at this point of what the projection could be. It could be, we can speculate as much as 50%. We don't know yet.
Yeah, the Babcock Ranch, that's I have not visited, but I read a lot about it, 20 years ago. It's probably been in operation, I would say, about a decade. But that's a very large planned community, which with acres and acres and acres of land, very large acreage that was set aside specifically for solar production for that planned community. We're obviously in a heavily built out territory without the spaces to do that. So I think the assumptions that are in here in terms of penetration of rooftop, which is basically to double from where we are today, and I think it's going to continue to grow. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't, but I don't think it's going to get so big that it would change something that we would do right now. That it would say, hey, what are we talking about doing now? I don't think it's going to make a significant change, and we can adapt. We continue to watch it, and we can adapt the plan as we go forward. Maybe it causes to add more batteries sooner. I don't see it having an effect on demand response necessarily, but certainly it might drive the need for batteries to come in earlier, because the more overproduction we have during times of the year, what Greg's going to talk to us about called curtailment energy, right? The more that we have to curtail our solar, the more important batteries will become.
And we don't have any insight, because the Inflation Reduction Act also includes provisions for giving credits for these electric vehicles that could potentially connect back into the grid when the cars are not in use, correct? And we don't have any modeling for that.
Correct. Our what we've assumed is that our load growth, that means kilowatt hours or megawatt hours, not capacity, but megawatt hours, will grow at 0.5% per year. Current year, we're up about 2.4% through the end of August, but that's when compared to the prior year. But the prior year was a COVID year, which was down a little bit. So when we look at the long-term averages, 0.5% is probably reasonable. And we also just had 2 large developments come online between the Mid and the Bohemian that were 230 to 200 plus customers per. So, I don't know that we're necessarily going to sustain that growth, but we're modeling around a 0.5% growth in megawatt hours send out to our customer base. But keep in mind that all of the load that we added with the Bohemian just makes up for all the load that we lost from solar net metering over the prior years. Because we have roughly 200 by the end of this year, the next few months, we'll have probably a couple of hundred customers on net metering. So the gains in the Bohemian just basically get us back to where we were before net metering came on strong. So net growth is may not be that large. But again, that's why we would revisit these things every few years and say, how are we doing? And
Well, the other aspect is that we do high demand, low demand. And our high demand is somewhat robust.
Yep. Good point.
And also on the behind the metering, we do, it may be an exogenous input, but across our 9 scenarios, it does vary based on the sensitivity to natural gas prices or demand and other items that could cause a change in behavior.
So this high natural gas model and high capacity, so capacity would be up around that $54 per kilowatt year number, and the high natural gas, we can say, okay, so demand response starts to look like a reasonable thing to take a look at. So to that end, and we had previously discussed this, and we're going ahead, we've got some pricing. We need to now put together the cost of a demand response program. We're ready to release it, a consultant to go put that together for us. Because if the model is saying that, gee, it looks attractive, so now let's get specific. What technology will we use? What will it cost? How effective it will be? What's the rollout period? And then move into preparing an RFP. So we're ready to go and get to the next level of demand response. Now, under the other model, under the base case, demand response didn't come in later, but recognizing that it's a subject of high interest, and there's at least one model that says, gee, it might be worthwhile to have now. I'd rather jump in and get some groundwork done so we're closer to an actual deployment than if we didn't do it. So we are going to go ahead and begin that effort of researching demand response in great detail.
We have another scenario here that I want to show you quite quickly, and that is St. Lucie may or may not have a life extension. They've applied for a life extension and were, I think, initially rejected, but they're presumably going to go back and reapply. If that occurs, then in contrast to this steep decline in after 2043, it would be extended an additional 20 years, so through 2063. And so that doesn't change the near term. We'll actually look at this in just a second, but it doesn't particularly impact the near term. But what it does is it changes the amount of solar entitlement that is incorporated or is assumed under this assumption. We can then summarize those 4 cases slightly differently in a tabular form. So it was a reference case, a reference with a lower solar PPA, a higher high natural gas and the $54, and then the reference St. Lucie. And so what we can do then is look at selected years. When we work with clients, we really want to provide visibility into what we call the action plan or the next 5 years. A lot of times that's the time frame for critical decisions. So we're showing the rollout of the need for capacity under the different scenarios. So right now, our reference case is not showing any additional capacity until 2029 with the battery, but if we reduce the solar PPA, we're showing essentially the same follow-on plan, the slightly lower utility scale, but higher solar PPA, and we acquire that in 2024. And then a much more robust use of the solar PPA a little bit earlier on the battery, and then demand response comes in consecutively in 4 tranches from 24 through 27. So these terms are favorable these conditions are favorable to renewables and solar.
So Greg, if I look at the reference, let's say the $35 PPA, if such a thing existed, what this is hypothetically saying, into that case, if you had a $35 number, you would grab another 5 megawatts of solar at utility scale, correct? It has to be at $35, right?
Yeah, it has to be at $35.
Right.
In order for it doesn't come in at 40, it comes in at 35.
Okay. And then what gas price goes along with that case, the $35 solar in that reference case?
Okay, so this is Henry Hub. So the delivered prices to Lake Worth Beach are going to be higher due to transmission and then a local distribution charge. But Henry Hub in this case is starts at under $6 and then reverts back actually to slightly below $4 before it goes into mid $4 range and eventually out to about $7 by the end of the time frame. That's in contrast to our high case and our low case. I can tell you that the natural gas curve as of close of business today is higher than this reference case. It's about $7 into the winter, and then it comes down pretty hard to around $5, and it stays around $5. So it's about it's falling in between our high NG and our reference case.
And
so
that data is readily available to anybody. You can just go find it on the internet, and that'll give you the NYMEX contract, which is what we refer to as the Henry Hub price, and then you add some dollars for delivery to the market zone where the power plants are. That number could run as low as 20 cents. Unfortunately, not too many months ago, that number that delivery cost had grown to $7 or something like that, but $6 or $7. But that's an anomaly I've never seen in the Florida market. But in many decades of watching it, I don't remember seeing it at all. But it did happen. So these gas cases might be a little bit on the low side, but not that far off.
well, and of course, what we do is because we have a high natural gas and the base, we can look to see the difference between those cases and kind of interpolate between assumptions to see what it might mean. Or we can simply run another curve if there's some interest in doing that.
Before you leave that page, the table there, it would be helpful, at least for me, to know which are things that you're hardwiring as inputs versus which are things that are modeled outputs. For instance, I'm looking at your high natural gas one, and you mentioned demand response comes in 4 tranches. Well, that sounds like that's a hardwired input to the model, not that the model concluded that you ought to bring in exactly 1 more megawatt the next year and another megawatt the next year.
Okay, so it's based on economics. We do have we make assumptions on how quickly programs can ramp up. So we have a 1 megawatt per year increase assumption on it and a saturation level. But this is not unlike BTM, behind the meter, this is not a hardwired assumption. This is based on economics, and that sort of plays out. As you can see, it's the timing of demand response is varies by scenario, and that's because the economics of.
But my question would be, so I just want to understand fairly clearly which things are modeled as, economic behavior and people making choices versus, so what you've said is, well, we're going to hardwire the increase per year at 1 megawatt. We're going to have a saturation level that's also hardwired. So really the only thing that the model is solving for is when it comes in. Why not open it up? And similarly, when I'm looking at a modeled output that comes out at 15.00 every year, that doesn't seem like a model output. That seems like it's something is hardwiring in. A model output is going to be, it says 14.3 one year and 17.8 another year. Help me understand. And it does that, in fact, up at utility scale solar in the reference one, you're at 23.66. That seems like a much more of an open-ended model output, an unconstrained one, where it's solving for something.
So, your observations around demand response are correct. It's a limit of 1 per year and an aggregate of 4. These are very usual. Everything, to answer your question on which are economic, all these resources are made through economics. To answer your question about why 15.00, there's nothing hardwired or a limit in there. The model can build up to 50 megawatts in a single year. Now it's a solar PPA. So our solar PPAs are assuming near-term known energy prices or some information about. So either in 24 or 25, it can build up to 50 total megawatts. I mean, these are pretty usual things. Now, if you're asking why not demand response up to 50 megawatts or something like that, it's based on an assumption of saturation levels for a system the size of Lake Worth. Why increase it 1 megawatt per year? It's a reasonableness. We just made a reasonableness assumption. I mean, this is doubling. 1 megawatt's a lot. Doubling it in a given year is a lot. It's just it's a reasonable assumption on how a program such as this would grow over time.
So let's try it. Let's try it this way then. So, for example, one of the quirks of a solar power purchase agreement is you can't vary the number of a year. You enter in the contract, and that's the number for 20 years, right? You can't say, well, this year I want the PPA to be 15. Next year I want it to be 16.2. No, it's 15. You entered into a 15 contract, right? So you pick a number. So I think that's a reasonable approach in the model. The demand response model.
I think the important part, I don't disagree with reasonable assumptions being part of a modeling exercise. I've been around models a long time, and that's perfectly reasonable. It's just very important to separate out what are assumptions and inputs to the model and what are things that the model actually freely solved for. And that's what came out, you know.
Mm-hmm. So let's address the demand response component and how we got to that. Recall that I threw a number of 5 megawatts out there purely by observation of what seems to happen in the system when cloud cover comes in from the west and seems to shed 5 megawatts of load. That's not a very detailed scientific way of looking at it, but it's as best as we could say. That's probably an indicator of what would happen if you started turning off a bunch of air conditioning units. Maybe you could drop 5 megawatts. And then you have to look at the realities. Well, how could you get that many, how many customers do you have to hook up to actually get a megawatt or 2 megawatts or 3 megawatts, and how quickly could you hook them up? And will they actually respond? Will they stay in the program, or are they just going to take the money for participating and not actually respond when you need them to? So I think doubling, going up by 1 megawatt per year is a reasonable assumption. But again, the next study that we're going to do, which will be specific to demand response with somebody who's familiar with demand response programs, will be to guide us and say, hey, this is what it should cost you. This is what your rollout deployment rate would be. This is how fast we think the market will adopt it, because we can't force people to buy it. It's a voluntary procurement, right? On the part of a resident. And unlike the other products, unlike rooftop solar, this is a product that a tenant, we believe, could purchase. You wouldn't have to be, I don't think you'd have to be the owner of the property to enter into the demand response program. I believe we'd have to allow the rules to do that, right? But certainly if we can get a more aggressive sign up, if the economics of demand response turn out to be lower than the model assumed, then we would go for more, right? Because the goal is to be able to deploy demand response in lieu of purchase capacity. Right?
Yep.
So if we can buy it cheaper through demand response and it's as effective, why wouldn't we, right? But we need to go figure that out next.
And I also want to point out too, that these are just select cases that we decided to propose to share tonight. As Greg mentioned earlier, we're doing, 96 different sensitivities around this. So, and we're allowing partial builds. So it's just coincidence that you're seeing that solar PPA coming at 15. It varies. If I look at it across the scenarios, it varies from 1.4 megawatts to 16.8 megawatts. So it's not really a hardwired assumption.
Good point, Catherine.
Yeah, and I think, I don't, as I said before, I don't have a problem with hardwired assumptions. It's just very important for interpretation of the model output to understand, to have it clearly labeled, which are the assumed ones, or which are, we threw all this stuff in and the model cranked and we believe the processes and so on, and this is what came out. This is a model result as opposed to an input or a hardwired or an assumption.
So Greg, if we go back to the models, I want to laser in on demand response, because that's something that we want to come out of this with better direction than we had going in, right? So it seems to me that demand response is the amount, or rather whether we do demand response or not, is driven by assumptions, right? It's safe to say that that the model says you should have demand response at some point. The question is that now, or is that a few years from now, right? Can we go back to the models that showed that? Because
The scenarios.
right. So when we use this as a planning tool, so there's demand response at the top that says wait till 2030, all right, in the base case, right? Or no, I'm sorry, take that back. It looks like it's as early as some of it in 29, right?
Yep. Yeah.
So
Somewhere in there.
But the important thing is that the model is saying that, hey, demand response is a tool that you should have in your toolbox, right? That we should do this. Now, there's another case where demand response happens much earlier, right now. So what this says to me as a utility planner is to say, you better get serious about demand response now, because at best you have a few years, likely you may need it tomorrow, right? Or possibly you might need it tomorrow. So demand response is something that you should act on, and then get this, if you will, I'll use the term, the strike price, and would just say, yeah, get me a whole bunch of that stuff. But we need to know what it's actually going to cost us. You're using what you believe to be industry numbers for demand response programs, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
We actually based these on an FPL filing that provided some cost information. It was also informed by a pretty good summary provided by a Wisconsin utility, but it was for a comparable type of program.
So you actually have data that FPL, who's right here across the street from us, right, published and submitted to the Public Utility Commission here in Florida, the Public Service Commission. So we have to assume that's factual. So if we believe that that we would experience the same costs with a demand response program as FPL did, then that input has some validity. It's got some market testing to it, right? But I still want to go through the step of having somebody come in and look at our specific system and say, and our specific demographic, and say, are we symptomatic of what you'd see in all of FPL, or are we perhaps better positioned? What I've said in these things all along, I've said this with solar, I've said it with batteries. Some people might say batteries are not economic. And I don't disagree with that at the moment. I don't want to find out that batteries were economic 2 years ago and we didn't act on it, right? I want to understand pricing and the strike price, so that as we see that point in time arriving, we can be ready to roll with it and not be late to the market, even if it means taking a little bit of risk. Of course, I have to convince the commission to be willing to take that risk, but I think we need to be forward-leaning in these things that help us reduce our CO2 emissions and not reactive. And one could argue that, we've been forward-leaning with how much solar we took and nuclear.
So I'm going to jump forward here. I've showed this graph. The key point that I'd like to make is that the ability of Lake Worth Beach to meet carbon targets is heavily impacted through purchased energy from neighboring systems, to the degree that the neighboring systems are on a strong declining carbon path. So too, through purchases, Lake Worth can take advantage of that. Here's a carbon sensitivity. So I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly, but this is the same trajectory. So the graph on the right is pounds per megawatt hour. So it's a emissions rate on an energy basis. It's the same trajectory we were just looking at in the previous graph. There's a second trajectory, and this comes from Horizons Advisory, our own advisory work, in which we looked under our base case condition, which was a 60% reduction by 2050 in carbon emissions as this orange line. And then we have a very specific case called a zero carbon additions case, which only allowed non-carbon emitting resources to be built after a certain date, 2025. And that's this gray line. The gray line gets almost down to the, call it dark blue line. The dark blue line actually represents the trajectory based on a couple of selected points that Florida Power and Light has articulated. And we just basically, and frankly, a couple of interim points that were suggested by the utility director to get down to here. So on the left-hand side, we can see that the reference case following that Florida Power and Light kind of carbon trajectory, and assuming that level of carbon intensity is available, no problem meeting the emissions under all 9 scenarios. Here's the punchline though. If your neighbors don't hit that carbon limit, you're going to have an increasingly harder time, especially with the loss of St. Lucie in 2043, to hit that zero carbon limit in 2050. Now, obviously, a lot of things can happen, but my point is, because of the Lake Worth Beach makes significant level of purchases, and it's much cheaper for Lake Worth Beach to utilize those purchases under a high carbon scenario than to try to develop some very overbuilt system in order to get down to zero carbon by 2050 through, say, batteries and solar. There would have to be, sorry.
It would be hard to make a decision today on something that we're going to bring online in 2042 to hedge ourselves against whether St. Lucie actually gets a life extension license or not, right? But the point is that even if we entered into 20-year or even close to 25-year PPAs today, and 20 years as a norm, most of them are 15 to 20 years, we have a whole series of decisions to make, probably no less than every 5 years, and really laddering cleaner and cleaner stuff into the portfolio, especially if we see some inkling that license might not be renewed or something else might not take its place. I'd have to believe in the next 20 years, some small modular reactor is going to come on the market, probably in the next 5 to 10 years. That's going to address that issue, because that's not just a Florida issue, that's a national issue. There are many, many nuclear plants in the country that are required to keep that carbon footprint low and realistically can't be retired if you want to stay on a low carbon track.
Well, and I think too, the key point that Greg is pointing out though, is that if you were to just look at what Lake Worth Beach resources are emitting, your carbon emissions disappear in 2025 when Stanton goes away, because your gas-fired resources are not running. You're buying market energy from through FMPA. So it's all a matter of what's coming over the wires into your system that's going to drive that emission forecast.
Right. So while our ancient gas turbines still run, and we have a capacity value there, they run so few hours per year, they're a very low contributor to the CO2 emissions.
I want to just show at least one more graph. I know we're coming up on 8 o'clock. I don't want to keep people later, but this is an example, and I wanted to really focus on our reference or base case this evening. But this is a savings or cost assumption for a variety of the sensitivities that we are undertaking in the study, with a focus on the reference case. And so what we're doing here is we're taking the net present value of what's called revenue requirements. It's kind of a regulatory term. It incorporates the operating cost and the annualized capital cost, and then it discounts it back to today using the weighted average cost of capital of the city. It's a very standard methodology. So what that does is it takes into account the time value of money and all the costs associated with different plans. So what we want to do is just quickly call out how the sensitivities impact the differentials from the reference case. So in this case, savings are good. So a number below 470 is a good thing. So if the first sensitivity is an $18 kW year capacity market, that would be a very low capacity price, value of capacity over time. If that were to occur, the least cost plan reduces would reduce the total cost of the portfolio by $39 million. $54 is a break even. It's got a zero, very coincidentally, a zero benefit. $35 solar actually only reduces the cost, the total cost of the system by $1 million, which to us was surprising, but it's indicative of the value of solar PPAs in our reference case are between $35 and $40. That's
And
really
what size project was that? Or what size PPA was that?
It's whatever it's the same planning sizes as the base case. So it can build as little as, a fraction of a megawatt up to 50 megawatts of installed in either 24 or 25 or split it up.
But it doesn't make sense that regardless of the size, it would only save us $1 million.
No. So the answer to your question is how much did it take? And the answer is it took 5 megawatts.
Okay.
Sorry. So the model then shows a 5 megawatt PPA based on the $35 price.
Okay.
Solar life extension, St. Lucie extension, it's out in the future, but it has high value. So it only reduced those long-term costs by $11 million. We were provided with an in-city solar cost of, I believe, $62.50 on an in-city solar project. It increases the cost over the base case by $6 million. So it's a increasing cost assumption. We were provided with a $500,000 capital cost assumption on extending the life of GT2 10 years. So right now it's assumed to go off in 2027. Let's say it can, if you invest, say, $500,000, it can last 10 more years. It's only going to be available. It's going to run very little, but it's going to be available for capacity, valuable capacity. It is, in addition to the costs of doing that plan, it reduces the cost of the plan by $5 million. So we cover the costs and there's $5 million more benefit. So we're urging an additional look at that. Reference no additions. So no additions is where you just rely on like an all requirements contract based on our best guess as to what the forward market is under the reference case, and the savings is actually a cost. It's $50 million more. So doing this work for the reference case reduces the cost by $50 million. And then we did a carbon. This is not incorporating the cost of carbon of not meeting it under a higher CO2 trajectory, but its cost was $1 million more.
So on GT2, this is this kind of reinforced a gut feeling that we had. On GT2, we did a rebuild so that the unit basically has two components to it. There's the turbine, and then there's the generator. So the turbine we rebuilt in the spring of 2018, winter of 17 going the spring of 18, and we spent $1.2 million on that rebuild. And if we retire the unit, we have to write off the unamortized portion of that depreciation. So the generator, though, hasn't been looked at in a long time, and every unit that I know of that's of that age that's been treated in that manner, meaning poor maintenance and not the best of operation for decades and decades, needs a generator rebuild. Now we've been unable to really open that generator up to do an inspection because we know we're going to find problems, or we suspect we'll find problems, and we haven't had the money nor the time, meaning that we couldn't live without it with a single tie line anyway. So what the plan is there, especially reinforced by this $5 million savings in a short period of time, is to go ahead and in early 2024, after the second tie line goes operational, remember that happens December of 23. So in early 24, we would be in a position to open up that generator and pretty much plan on a rewind of that generator to get another 10 years of life out of it as a capacity tool, because it's got great value. So we've assumed the rewind cost of $500,000, and the model is telling us that we're going to save $5 million. So that's a pretty compelling argument. So look for us to want to do that. GT1 is in a slightly different position. The turbine itself is an unknown condition after many, many years of not being looked at. And you really can only see so much with a borescope. And of course, the generator, you can't really do an inspection on pretty much without doing a pretty significant disassembly. And that's an oil-fired machine. And we don't use that a lot in our capacity plans anyway. That's really more of an emergency unit. Because that's 1965 vintage. But until it fails, we're going to keep it. We're not going to purposely destroy it, but we're not going to make a big investment in it. But GT2 we would. Now GT2 is fed by the gas line contract, which was entered into around 2003, which I believe only has about another 12 years left on that contract before we won't have a contract for gas pipe to the power plant that would support that unit anyway. So it looks like the rewind of the generator is going to be a smart play and keep that unit alive.
So
Is it-
these,
Would it be
All right.
fair to say, looking at this table, that these all vary by a max of about plus or minus 10%? And some of them are more like 1%. So that the range of the scenarios is not hugely different. You know, is that a fair characterization?
yes, and it's kind of the nature of the business, because this is the beauty of optimization. So when you look at this, when you look at the total value, the total PVRR, these numbers are big, and these numbers tend to be small because the models is optimizing. It's making exactly the right decisions at the right time. So yes, there are small percentages, but they're significant dollars.
Okay.
Is this basically is this a net present value on a 25-year number?
However many, so 23 through 50 consecutive, so that sounds like 28 years.
27.
28, yeah, okay. So this is a pretty powerful tool, and say, hey, you know, the net present value, the revenue requirement for the utility for the load growth that we expect is in the $470 million range. Right? So if you were to write somebody a check, in theory, if you write somebody a check for 470 today, you get energy delivered for the next 28 years and capacity. Okay.
It's also a valuation. It's also what would oftentimes be considered a valuation. I don't want to go beyond, we're already at our 8 o'clock. I just wanted to I'll just say a couple of quick things. The solar PPA, we did 96 scenarios, and it varied between 0 and it's actually, as Kathy was saying, about 17 megawatts, and it averaged to 6 megawatts. We continue to be sensitive to the carbon impact of imported energy, and we'll make that, have a discussion about that in the report. We talked about the extension in 2028 of GT2 and Unsolar, and the value of undertaking planning and over just relying on our view of forward markets. So that's where we're at today. The results are not finalized, but they are close to final. We have written a report, and it is 80+% complete. A lot of the final work to do on it is to summarize results and then to make it available for comment and edit. We look to, frankly, unless the city looks for us to do additional steps, we look to finish this effort in the next few weeks.
So our goal, I believe, was to try to be at the city commission, either at the October meeting or the November meeting, ideally at the October meeting, with a presentation on the work that's been done and the scenario planning, because we do have some upcoming decisions to make, which are hinged, or where this study should be taken into account. Obviously, going ahead with demand response, which we're going to be doing anyway, in terms of the next level of study with that. We do have more decisions to make on whether or not we want to grab more solar PPA. I don't know that we can get the $35 number. I know that there's a $40 number that's out there publicly. But those types of things would be important. And I want to make sure that the advisory board, and at some point, I know we want to go, Ryan, if you want to go around the table and see if do people have other scenarios that they envision that we should be modeling? Do they agree with the trajectory, which, frankly, I just threw out there as a, absent any direction. I'll throw that out there and see if anybody salutes it, right? Does everybody feel comfortable with that glide path that we proposed?
Yeah, that was an issue I was having, because everyone I approached on the topic, they seemed indifferent about the glide path, and they were more concerned about the immediate effects of costs. And I think that the board's position as a public input generator was somewhat reduced about 3 years ago, where we're not really encouraged to go out into the public and ask for feedback. So short of actually having a town hall, I guess sanctioned by the city and hosted at, like, say, the beach complex or somewhere else, we don't really have the capacity to have these kind of public discussions in mass. So I think the original ask back 3 or 4 meetings ago was to pick a date, correct? So the 2050 was a guideline, but the task was what kind of glide path date do we anticipate? Could it be 2045 like FP&L? Could it be 2060? Could it be, could we just delay a little bit longer, make it 2075, right? So we don't even have that answer. I don't know about any of the other board members, if they were able to get some public input or not, based on who they've spoken with. Now's your chance to speak up and kind of give us your input. Eric,
I got some. I talked to a few people, not many. It wasn't super scientific, but most of the people I talked to didn't want to make personal sacrifices for carbon reduction, especially in terms of cost, because they were already paying enough. There were some that were. So like you were saying, they were more concerned about the cost, the immediate cost, than the glide path.
Yeah, in a perfect world, everyone's like, let's go carbon free tomorrow if it doesn't cost us anything.
Well, then I think one of the constellations, and Greg, correct me if I'm interpreting this wrong, that the market is going to be getting cleaner whether we want to or not, right? So, and I don't mean that we should say we don't want to, but to that extent, the sources of power that we buy out of our supplemental contract are all getting cleaner than they are today, right? Whether we do anything or not. So it would, and that's also the cheapest source of power, right? So we didn't model building a 15 megawatt coal plant, right? And there'd be no sense in building a 15 megawatt coal plant, right? We'd probably never get the air permit, and B, I suspect there's a number of commissioners that would not support that. But and I'm not even sure that it would ultimately be cheaper than natural gas anyway. But it's like there's almost no path that we would go on which would not get us pretty darn close to zero by 2047, 48, 49 anyway, right?
Yeah. And so to speak anecdotally about, some of the people I've talked to about this, I think obviously low cost power, that's what everybody wants. But more than that, like price predictability and stability, like hot on everybody's mind is rolling blackouts across Texas. And this is me, my supposition on top of what I hear from people when they say stable power, but it just, seems like a big risk to offload a lot of our energy production to have to import it from a third-party company that's for profit and operates on the margins like that. I like that just seems like it could go wrong, like perhaps it did for Texas.
So let me address that. Those are very, very good points. So let me ameliorate some of the concerns and the fears around that. First of all, the 36.55 megawatts of solar, while it is owned by a private developer who's clearly in it for profit, right? They're not a charity. We have a contractual price. One of them is fixed and the other is escalating at 1 or 2% per year. So that's a known price. So where gas could go to $5, $10, $15, $35, go to Europe like $90, doesn't matter. That's a known price. Nuclear is a locked-in price, and we're going to have that through 2043. We're basically paying the debt service on the plant, and recently renegotiated the debt service and saved ourselves $2.5 to $3.5 million a year by doing that. The other solar, the supplemental power that we have is priced using a fixed heat rate, which I can't disclose. There's a pricing mechanism. And then, of course, it follows natural gas market price. But today, that's in the range of roughly 50% of our power supply. And that's going to decrease to about, I would say, 40 to 45% of our power supply as we add more solar. So the portion of our portfolio that's subject to the vagaries of the carbon fuel market is becoming a smaller and smaller percentage as we add more solar to the portfolio.
Understood on that. I guess in the earlier graphs we were looking at, it's more of that shaded region. I guess what is the source of that import power pricing? All of those dotted regions.
Those
like
dotted regions. That's the supplemental contract, and the supplemental contract
that pricing's fixed like that.
It's fixed for a 7-year period of time, and the capacity number is fixed, and the energy number is a fixed efficiency, if you will, multiplied times the actual cost of fuel in the market at the time it's produced.
So there's two issues there. One is the stability of the contract. The other is our exposure as consumers to fuel prices. And
when you say the stability of the contract, what are you referring to?
Well, you mentioned it's a 7-year contract. So part of the price is fixed, but the most significant part of what we actually pay, this is why we just raised the rates in July, is that the fuel cost went hugely up, and that just gets passed through to us. And so I think, I'm not sure if I understood exactly what Eric was referring to, but I know from what I hear from consumers is a factor for people is if I knew that my price of juice was going to be constant or near constant for the next 20 years because I'm getting it from a solar panel or a bunch of solar panels, I like that idea better than that I'm getting it from a high percentage from natural gas, because not only is there an environmental benefit, but the natural gas price can do all sorts of wild things.
That math doesn't work, Commissioner, because I can't get solar to you 24 hours a day without matching it up with the battery. And then when I give you that firm price for 24 hours a day of solar power, you're not going to be able to afford it. So what we're talking about doing here is growing our solar. So it's so nuclear right now is 39%, and growing our solar under the existing contracts will grow to about 20% and continuing to grow it. But to think that you're going to be 100% solar, even if you put your own solar system in, you're not going to be able to do it unless you invest in storage. And once you add the storage component, the cost is going to go up significantly. So the reality is that a carbon fuel or natural gas, or way down the road, gas plus a blend of hydrogen, is going to be a part of your portfolio. It's highly likely. The reality is that somebody is providing power to you when the sun goes down. Somebody made that investment. It's either in the form of a turbine or in the form of a battery, and it's got to be paid for.
And well, in the form of storage of some form. I've been building systems like this at a number of different scales for a number of years. Obviously, storage is a big deal. And right now, the kind of the trajectory, the trade-off is, do you want to get your storage by burning a fossil fuel, or do you want to get your storage by increasing other forms of storage that can do that? And at this point, sure, grid scale, utility scale battery systems are still pretty expensive. I was always amazed that you could do it at all, but you can for limited periods. So yes, I totally get that. Until we have a range of ways to store energy, whether it's converting it during the day into, producing hydrogen and then burning that at night, or whatever it is, or pumping water up, or many different things are being looked at. But all those technologies, the pressure to switch the storage from burning something to some other technology for storage, that pressure is intense right now worldwide.
Well, that's why I'm heartened by the fact that storage in this model, in the case we're looking at right now, says that, hey, battery storage 2027, that's not that far away. And if you increase the gas price, the storage is probably going to increase solar. The storage is going to come in sooner. And again, and also, so I'm pretty jazzed about the storage piece right now. And then we have perhaps some local micro benefits from storage that's tied to our distribution system at some spots where we might want to reinforce the system with storage. That could be pretty interesting, especially now that the tax laws would allow either direct payment or a tax advantage power purchase agreement, even if it's not built with solar. So that's pretty cool. And we need to be looking at that really hard right now.
The fact that the solar or the storage can be standalone, that it's not required to be produced, adjacent to the panels, gives us more flexibility. The IRA is a big deal.
And I'll give you a similar situation that as a matter of fact, we just experienced it last night. It's a good case for some limited amounts of demand response. So for those of you who don't know, you may have experienced it. We had a series of outages last night. We lost some 4 kV feeders coming out of what we refer to as the 4 kV house. And what we attempted to do, and it took about probably an hour and a half for some customers to switch load and swing those customers over to other 4 kV circuits. Now we're in the process of doing that. You push those circuits to their limit. So ideally those circuits would run at 200 amps or less per phase. We had times last night on the hairy edge where we were running 450 amps per phase as we doubled up customers on feeders, pushed that equipment well beyond its limits, well up there. Now, in that particular case, while I could say, hey, demand response doesn't appear to have a macroeconomic benefit until some number of years in the future, I certainly could have used demand response last night on some of those 4 kV feeders and laterals to help drop some load, right? So there are local situations where demand response and or batteries would come in to economic play before what this model tells us. But those are unique situations, but we should explore those and exploit them.
And also with the Inflation Reduction Act, is there provision for the adoption on a wide scale of electric vehicles, like say 10% per year? More people would be consuming electric vehicle charging, either from their homes or from other sources nearby.
There's a lot of speculation to how much, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but there's significant growth in sales. I think I've heard something like 40, 50, 60% growth in sales of electric vehicles, but I don't have a good feel penetration. And at the moment, the electric vehicle is a rather pricey vehicle. The price is coming down, but it's still a pricey vehicle. When you look at the economic demographic of Lake Worth Beach, you'd say, hey, I think it's going to be some time before large portions of our economic demographic grabs these vehicles. Now, having said that, let's tie that back to my concern with loading. One could speculate that the eastern part of the city, particularly the northeastern part of the city, is probably going to be in a position financially to adopt electric vehicles faster than the west or southwestern portions of the city, right? Those are the cities, the sections of the city that are going to see the conversion to 26 kV later in our planning horizon, meaning still another 5, 6, 7 years from now before we finish all of the 26 kV conversions up there. So if we see substantial load growth up there on the older 4 kV systems, one could argue that you might need or might want to have a quick limited deployment of demand response in those hot pockets, if you will, where you might see that growth, or battery energy storage to support that charging. But that's me just brainstorming, speculating without a lot of hard data, and assuming that the electric vehicles will be more rapidly adopted in the cities that are thought to be more affluent than other parts of the city, because they can afford and they would be able to afford the vehicles. Maybe the Inflation Reduction Act and the rather healthy rebates or tax benefits and the rollout of cheaper vehicles, for example, the Chevy Bolt, maybe the ID4, some of these vehicles that are out there in the low 30s, in the mid $30,000 range, maybe you'll see increased adoption and a tax benefit applying to the used car market as well for the electric vehicle. Maybe that'll drive adoption rates higher. But I'm really just brainstorming. I don't have firm data. I don't think we have a way of knowing what the true penetration rate for EVs specific to our electric utility territory is. We don't have a way of tracking what vehicles people own.
Well, you have one way potentially if people are installing the solar systems and they request that provision for the extra 3 kW. That's
one so far. but we also know that we have about 65 regular users, 65 distinct users every month using our public charging stations. My assumption is they're using our public charging stations because they might be cheaper than a charging station they have at home. But I don't know those 65 actually live in the territory. We don't have access to that data. Now, in theory, and we need a data analyst to do this, does the DMV track electric vehicle registrations by zip code? That would help us understand penetration rates and what they're growing at. But otherwise, it's very difficult for us to really know what it is. But we do know it's going to grow. Anybody who tells you electric vehicles aren't going to grow significantly doesn't know what they're talking about. They're going to grow dramatically, I think, in the next 5, 10, and 15 years, clearly.
And they do track it by zip code. I've only taken it down to the county level, but I do believe that you can get it down to the zip code level from the DMV.
Mm-hmm.
But in that same vein, though, we have another scenario, which we call our high demand scenario, which represents electrification consistent with the NREL's medium electrification scenario. So
Yes.
We'll be exploring a much higher increase in demand and the impact on the resource plans as well.
Right. So NREL is the National Renewable Energy Labs, right?
Yes.
Okay. So that's a federal agency, well-respected, solid data source.
Yeah, I would say if you're going to give a presentation to the commission, that you would include that model of assumed adoption rate of electric vehicles being high.
We also think and recognize that at some point in the future, there is going to be vehicle to grid technology. There's not that many vehicles that do it today, and there's 1 or 2 pilots underway in the country. And there's not a uniform standard, but I don't think it's going to change the decision that we make in the next 6 months. But certainly if we're sitting here together 3, 4, 5 years from now, we're going to be talking about that in great detail, because I think that is coming. And I think we're actually going to see that faster than we're going to see solar embedded in rooftop shingles. But I think it's going to look just like solar with a battery, where customers who have their own solar are going to have a storage device in the vehicle. We have an employee who built 2 ground-mounted systems at his home and has 2 storage systems. And he's a great source of anecdotal information on how that's performing. He doesn't live in the city, but it actually worked rather well for him through what he represented to be dozens and dozens of interruptions during the recent hurricane. And he lives out in the western portion of the county. So
Yeah, it's a small scale, but I think also we have I can't say significant because I don't have the data on this, but there seems to be dozens, if not under 100 people with golf carts. I'm not sure what the technology is going to look like in 10 years, if those can be like considered mini EVs, where you can also plug those back into the grid when you're not using them.
Right. So I'd like to think that, and this is, I'm really speculating here, that somebody who might have considered, spending 10 to 15,000 or $6,000 to $12,000 to put a Generac generator on their home, fueled by natural gas, might at some point say, "Gee, why don't I just have buy a car and that's electric and use the battery in the car to achieve the same output, the same outcome." Of course, it's not going to have the load factor of a generator in terms of ability to run for days on end, but it might give them some ride through. Of course, our challenge as an electric utility is to make our system so reliable they don't need to do that either. So, but be that as it may, the world is going to change. I think every utility planner, resource planner, I've been doing resource plans for decades. You're constantly evolving, constantly evolving.
So are we as a board still tasked with picking a glide path, or what's going on with the
I would say yes, it would help. If nothing else, do you endorse the glide path that we've chosen for the study? Which literally I just threw one on the table and said, let's start with this one. But does the committee feel comfortable with the path that we've chosen, or do you suggest a different one? Which is fine too. You don't have to agree with the one we chose.
Well, based on what you stated today with our neighboring utilities pretty much picking the path for us, and a large portion of our electricity is coming from these purchase agreements for the next coming years, we're on our way, quickly. So 2050 seems very reasonable. I mean, I don't know if there's some kind of motive to beat FP&L by 6 months for bragging rights or whatever it may be. But I think 2045 to 2052 is a good range.
Why don't we agree to meet in 2050 and see how we did? We'll put it in the time capsule and say, how did we do? Which is probably not a bad idea. Did we leave you? Were we good stewards of what we handed to you, and have somebody open it in 30 years and say, hey, look at this? I can say right now that the people who chose nuclear for us in the 1980s were good stewards. They may not have been seen that way every step of the way, every year along that path, but we look back now and said, boy, I'm really glad that we have 38% of our energy coming from something that's going down in cost, as opposed to something that's going up in cost and I can't control. But that's a different perspective.
Yep. I mean, I just hope the battery technology in the future is very capable of not spontaneously catching on fire, causing massive damage like it randomly does today. So if it progresses in a way where it can be very safe and affordable, that's a good way to go. We do have a comment from Mr. Stevens. If I can just read that real quick. It says, before the meeting adjourns, I would like to say thanks to Director Liberty and everyone on the Lake Worth Beach Electric Utility team for all the work they've done and are doing to harden our grid for tropical events like Ian. I know I'm not alone in my gratitude for the lights staying on last week. So yes, thank you very much. I did not experience so much as a blip the entire time myself on the north end. So thank you.
You're welcome, and I can share. I mean, it's kind of off the subject of the meeting, but I can give you a quick update. We did bring in 50 additional line workers, and another 21 tree trimmers, and we had them hunkered down in nearby hotels if we needed them. We had our own regular contract tree trimming crews on around the clock. We doubled up on our troubleshooters around the clock. And we shifted our line workers to A and B shifts. So we always had 2 crews on the property at any one time. We did not actually deploy into the field the visiting workers. We had them here for about 3.5 days, and then we released them. We had wind gusts up into the mid 50s, steady winds in the 35 to 40 mile an hour range at one point. I can tell you that we had no failures on any portions of the system that we had performed strip work on, that performed admirably. And now that was, it was designed for category 5, and we had gusts into the mid 50s. So certainly well short of category 5, but it points to how well we did. But the highest number of customers we had at any one time was a little over 200. I think we got to maybe about 0.7% of our customers at any one time. The neighboring utility had about 1.4 to 1.5% of their customers in Palm Beach County out at any one time. And we got the 0 out before they did. That doesn't mean that we're better. It may just mean that we're luckier and we had more staff out there. A big portion of the credit goes to those linemen and the tree crews that really worked around the clock, solving problems and restoring services as the problems occurred. So within an hour or 2 or 3 of an outage on a few homes, they had those homes back up. I don't think we had a single pole that came down. We had some spans of wire that came down, but no poles. And I think we might have had maybe one event in an area where we had done trip, and I think it was just vegetation. And there was a contact, we cleared the vegetation, and it was done. So we did well. I call this a pruning by Mother Nature. It cleared a lot of the dead wood out of the trees and palm fronds. We're not out of the woods. We have a number of years ahead of us with strip. And for those of us experienced an outage last night, probably saw that. That was a 1970 vintage piece of equipment that failed and took hundreds of customers out for some period of time. But and that's on the SHRIP list. It's in the Series 22 bond fund dollars to get after that problem. But we did well, and then we offered 2 of our crews to go to another FMEA city as the storm cleared. And as soon as we got into the clear, it was mid-morning on Friday, we released all of our visiting crews to go chase the storm and help others out. And they rolled right away, I believe, to Orlando. Orlando picked them up quickly. So we got lucky. And FPL, obviously we don't work for FPL, but they've got an excellent system. Yet look at what happened on the West Coast in Lee County. It's just devastating. So our hearts go out to those customers and what they're going through. Terrible.
And then just one final question: with a double tie line hookup in a category 5 storm, what's the percentage of likelihood that both could go out?
Very, very slim. So I can share with you that even our single tie line has 2 FPL lines that come into it. Either one of those 2 FPL lines will serve our single line. That same configuration will take place when we connect the canal. There'll be 2 FPL lines. So we actually have the option for 5 different FPL lines to feed our single system. We're going from actually 4. There'll be 4 FPL lines that could feed our system as opposed to the current 2. And then we still have our single line in between. So, and they're all fed from different sources that are unrelated. Now, kudos to FPL for the hardening they've done on their transmission system. We didn't have a single blip on the transmission system at all. If you go back to Irma, which was just a little bit higher wind speeds, we had substantial issues with the transmission interconnection and lost the whole tie line for a period of time. So the transmission's in much better shape today than it was 5 years ago. And after December 23, it's going to be dramatically better.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for Horizons for this presentation. Is this information going to be made available as backup on the city website?
Ed, I don't see any reason why not.
Well, I don't see any reason why not. That's fine.
Well, so yes, we will plan on doing that. Yes. Thank you for everybody's time tonight.
Yep. Thank you all as always.
Have a good night.
All right.
All right, thank you.
Oh, do you need to call for an adjournment, Ryan?
Well, I was gonna say, are there any board comments for any other issues not relating to Horizons this evening? All right, board liaison, Mr. Liberty, do you have anything extra to add?
No, I think I've worn everybody out already and let you all go home and or get to dinner and wrap up the evening with your families.
All right, do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn?
Do I?
I'll se-
All
I'll
right.
second that.
Thank you very much,